Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Tonight we're going to do, I call these in my head a number of different things, but I think of them as being more the whimsy episodes. They're not the hard history, and I like the fact that we do them. We've had some feedback from our listeners that they like them too, so we wanted to do a little bit more. But this one is actually inspired by the fact that we like to do the whimsy episodes, but it's also inspired by some of the conversation on the very last episode that was released where things went a little bit in the Diana, Duchess of York episode. So this is inspired by that, and inspired by the fact that we like to do it. On my screen, I have Mr. Robert Koshu. Robert, how you doing this Sunday evening that we're recording?
Very good. Thank you, Don. Hello, everybody.
And I have a pair of Erics. I have Eric Rush to my left. So, Mr. Rush, how are you this evening?
Doing fine, Don. Looking forward to talking about some Star Trek.
I am too. And I have Eric Bond over to the right. And I just need to, this is a public shout out to Eric here. One of the things that Eric does that's really cool behind the scenes for the show is when Eric's going to be on a show and he has the time to do it, he writes us some really good background notes. And as a result of that, I think we all do our research, but it's nice to have Eric sort of outline and what's there. And so just want to give a public shout out to Eric, Mr. Eric Bond here for doing that, because it makes the show better for you, the listeners, even though you don't see what we see in front of us. So thank you, Eric. How are you this evening?
Oh, I'm doing well, Don. Gosh, you're making me blush here.
Well deserved. Well deserved.
Thank you.
So Eric Rush sort of let the cat out of the bag topic-wise, which is perfectly okay. We're going to talk a little Star Trek here tonight. Now, we've had a couple of episodes that we've talked Star Wars. So this is the first time we've come back to Star Trek. So I just want to, before we get into all the rest of this that we'll do, I just want to do a quick poll around, because I know that some of the guys that I'm looking at here are Star Trek fans. Is everybody a fan here of both of the Star fill-in-the-blank universes, or there are some people who they choose one over the other. They feel like you can't be both. So just want to establish where our baseline is at.
I disagree that you can't be both. If I had to choose one, I would probably choose Star Trek, but I like them both very well.
Okay. Mr. Bond?
I would lean more towards Star Trek, but I consider myself a pretty diehard fan of both.
Okay. And Mr. Koshu?
I'm an equal opportunity nerd.
Okay, there you go. I think I would find myself more along the lines of Eric Rush here in the terms of, if I had to choose, if there could only be one, if there was a Highlander approach to this, that's a whole other episode we might do someday about the best, worst movie ever. But I think I would choose Star Trek, and we may talk, that'll probably come out as we go through the process of talking about it here, as we talk about the evolution of this, because I do think there's been a lot more evolution to Star Trek as an entity in science fiction to some degree than there has been of Star Wars. And I think that's what we find interesting. But of course, what we do here is alternate history. So you might be already wondering, if you're a listener, how are we going to do something alternate here for Star Trek? And what we've decided is to focus on Star Trek in between what we know as TOS. So if we use abbreviations for those that don't know, that would be the original series. That would be 79 episodes, originally aired on the NBC television network from 66 through 68, if I'm remembering my dates correctly. Most of us that were kids, in my case, born in the late 60s, so a kid of the early 70s, I never saw them in first run. I saw them on syndication, and they were very, very popular on syndication in the early 70s. And then the next television series that we have in the real timeline for Star Trek is not until 1987, when we have Star Trek: The Next Generation. Now, between the end of, by the way, there was one other series. There was an animated series that ran in the early 70s, which is an interesting little offshoot. You find that there's this little pocket of, by the way, we may get into Trekkies versus Trekkers here at some point too, because that's another interesting thing that's out there in the Star Trek fandom universe. But there are some Trekkers, which, by the way, is what I prefer there are some Trekkers that are real devotees of the animated series, and then you get into the whole question, by the way, just like Star Wars, of what's canon and what's not canon. And most of the time, the animated series is sort of considered to be outside of canon, although it introduces some things that show up in later places. So I think we have officially, if we didn't already have them, we have earned our nerd or geek cards tonight, as the case might be, that we know this. But our point of departure is going to be that there was a flirtation in the 70s, a couple of flirtations actually, where it looked like Star Wars. I knew I was going to do that. I've got it out of my system. It's already done. That Star Trek was going to come back as a TV series. We'll talk a little bit about the why for that as we move through here, but that it was going to come back as a television series and was actually going to be the anchor for a network. It was going to be Paramount's network, Paramount being the company that's owned the property ever since, by the way, Desilu, the Desi there being Desi Arnaz and the Lou being Lucille Ball. A lot of people don't realize there's a connection between Lucille Ball and Star Trek. That's a whole other thing. But Paramount owned the property, and they were looking to launch a rival broadcast television network in the mid-70s. And one of the ideas was they needed something that would be a strong anchor to launch that. And so the idea would be that this Star Trek show, which was went under the name of Phase 2, would be that iteration. And so our point of departure is going to be that we actually get, and Eric Bond here, what year would we probably pick for this? 70?
I wrote it down somewhere. Let me go back. Yeah, 1977. So
the idea is that the network would launch in 77 with Phase 2, Star Trek Phase 2, as its sort of its anchor show, the premiere show, the thing that was going to attract eyes to this new rival upstart network would be this. So that's what we're going to take as our point of departure. And I think we're going to see that it has lots of interesting ripples in the universe as we know it, before we would even get into a Kelvin timeline, because that's also a whole other thing for those of you that are in the Trek now. So, Eric, you gave the notes for us. Eric Bond, I'm going to let you sort of give us a little bit of the background. What in the world was Star Trek Phase 2?
Oh, my goodness. Okay, well, Don, you alluded to it very briefly. How can I say it? In a world that is almost producers-esque for anybody who's a fan of the Mel Brooks movie and subsequent musical, it would seem like there was a constant start and stop effort from Gene Roddenberry to the folks who bought out Desilu Gulf Western to bring Star Trek back in some way or fashion. So at first it was going to be a movie, then a TV series in 1972, then another movie called Planet of the Titans, among many other different variations that basically Roddenberry would write a film treatment, be told this is too much like an episode, or this is very weird. Why do you have Scotty teaming up with Hitler and JFK? That is a real film that they wanted to make at one point, but let's not get into that. And then after Planet of the Titans fell through, they finally decided, let's make a Star Trek Phase 2. This is going to be a second 5-year mission following most of the original characters from the show, with the exception of Spock, who would have become the head of the Vulcan Science Academy. Mostly because Leonard Nimoy had a very bad falling out with Gene Roddenberry following the original show, and Paramount over mostly business practices, some personal stuff, but a lot of it was just how funds were distributed from syndication, because the company Gulf Western was making millions in syndication off of Star Trek. If you weren't watching the news at 6 o'clock, you were watching Star Trek on your home station.
Yeah, and I actually found that part of the background fascinating or interesting in the sense of, because I'm familiar with that. I'm of that generation. I was a kid, so that's how I became first exposed to it. I didn't really understand what syndication was. So I didn't understand all the business aspects of it as I'm seeing this show that I knew was, a show. Because I was also getting a healthy dose of Gilligan's Island. I was getting my Petticoat Junction and Green Acres and the other shows, the Brady Bunch and Partridge Family and the other things that were staples of early to mid to late 70s syndication. Boy, I just really dated myself in a lot of ways for people that know that television era, but that's what it is. But Star Trek was unique when it went to syndication, Star Trek here being the original series, and that normally you had to have somewhere in the neighborhood of about 100 episodes to be considered viable for syndication, because you're going to be on 5, maybe 6 nights a week in some markets or during the day. And so you had to have enough episodes that, wait a second, I saw this episode 4 weeks ago, kind of problem wouldn't be constantly cropping up. And that was actually... Star Trek ended up producing 79 episodes, so it hadn't met sort of the normal requirement for syndication, but they managed to get it into syndication. And I'm going to argue that one of the magics of it in syndication, just as we set the background here before we jump into the diversion, was having a fewer number of episodes actually worked to its benefit, because we became very familiar with the episodes that were typically aired. And even inside of that group of 79 episodes, there was a subset of the episodes that were probably the top 30 to 35 that got a lot more air. The worst Star Trek original series episode ever. We'll fight about
Brain.
this. Yeah, thank you.
Spock's Brain.
You went there before I even had to go there, Eric.
It was awful.
It was awful. I think I actually did not see Spock's Brain until I was like in high school, even though it had been in syndication for so long, because they would just sort of skip over it, like in the rotation. There was no reason to show this horrible episode.
I was in college.
Episode is the last one, Turnabout Intruder. Mostly because it's just such a cringy ending where he goes like, if only she wasn't born a woman.
Which is even...
there's a lot of cringy stuff in a lot of cringy stuff. And if you even the first couple of seasons of Next Generation, when you watch that, you're just like, that's not that we don't do that anymore.
Into our conversation about Phase 2.
Yeah.
And the only other thing I wanted to pick up sort of on the backstory, because this is important about why there was this desire to get to a Phase 2, was that I read a couple of stories online that I think are more or less accurate, although it's interesting you can get pulled down this internet rabbit hole, about the fact that we think of TV ratings as being something that is very scientific. And to some degree that it is, but the measurement technology that exists in the 60s versus, what's able to be done now in terms of passive measuring didn't exist. So the famous Nielsen ratings were people filling out a diary, telling you what they said they watched, whether they actually watched it, or not. You had no way of doing that. And there were some folks that had, put devices in homes that did track the actual things that were there. And so one of the interesting things that you see when you start going down the Star Trek historical rabbit hole is whether the original series was a ratings hit or a ratings disaster. And depending on the case that's being made, I think there's actually data that supports whatever case you want to make. It's one of those things a good lawyer can argue either side of this story depending upon what it is. And one of the things that they argue is that they weren't factoring in demographics in ratings during most of the original series runs, such that they were just counting eyeballs, not which eyeballs who were tied to which dollars, and thus should have been really driving the commercial revenue. And so one of the stories that you hear that's, I think, true, but also probably somewhat apocryphal. It's really tough. And I know Eric went down this rabbit hole a lot in preparing our notes, figuring out what was real or what people say is real.
I know too much about Gene Roddenberry at this point, Don.
And whether he was real or not, it's a whole other discussion that we could have. Forget about Wyoming being real or not. Whether Gene Roddenberry was real or not, who knows? But there was even a notion that even very quickly, NBC said, why did we cancel this thing? When they really saw the ratings that they were getting from a demographic standpoint, that they should have never canceled in the first place. So that's why there was this quick desire to think about bringing it back, and then it becomes a hit in syndication.
Oh, it is so much more than a hit. So it funnels the 2 years of the animated series that hit when I was a kid, and honestly, I watched every episode of the animated series and loved every second of it. And then after that, a year right before this, remember, is 1976. And we ended up constructing a test space vehicle called the Space Shuttle. And it ended up with the name Enterprise because the Star Trek fans basically flooded the Oval Office.
Yeah. And even in the original series, it was able to be kept on the air by one of the most successful fan letter writing campaigns of all time. And so all of this is the important backdrop to why is this TV show that only ran for 3 years that either did or did not have great ratings, depending on who you talk to and what they mean by that. Why in less than a decade suddenly there's this tremendous interest in that. Not only should we bring it back, but it can anchor a whole network if we do this right. And part of that's what's happened in the period of time from 68, the animated series, the first convention where I think Shatner shows up to some place in New York and there's 3,000, 4,000 fans that are there, the whole phenomena that's going on. And so we get up to what Eric Bond was describing there. We get up to the mid 70s and this idea of this is not just potentially a viable television show, but it's big enough to launch a network.
Exactly. And the first script for a movie treatment that Roddenberry had written, The God Thing is what he calls it. Now, I'm going to ask you guys, I know this does not sound like any Star Trek episode at all, but just picture it. There's a strange satellite or ship that comes through with fantastical powers, and it claims to be God. I know that doesn't sound like any other episode of the original series or any other potential themes that have ever approached us, but that was his first submission. And the more I found out about it, it was just a weird story that sounded more and more like Roddenberry working out some things. If we ever post my notes, I basically start thinking I think Roddenberry was having some kind of midlife crisis in the 70s.
Well, there's even some of the notes that I saw that suggest he was going through by the time of the production of this thing. We'll talk about how it came into being. This is going to be one of those odd things about talking about the what if. You have to talk about the what did, because the what if is going to play so much into it, but that he was going through some type of thing. So let's just go ahead and get the Roddenberry stuff out now, because we'll be referring to it. Okay.
Yeah. So basically, he submits this script. It gets rejected. Eventually, it gets rewritten by Alan Dean Foster as In Thy Image. And then they say, this is a movie. This first thing that you showed us 5 years ago and has been rewritten by our friend, the author of Splinter of the Mind's Eye, is now the Alien pilot.
And Alien.
Alien.
Yeah. And so the movie that in the real timeline is Star Trek: The Motion Picture. If what you heard Eric Bond describe there sounds familiar, that sounds like Star Trek: The Motion Picture. Yes, there's a reason it sounds like Star Trek: The Motion Picture. It was that pilot sort of 2-hour premiere episode is what eventually became adapted into the first Star Trek: The Motion Picture, which they were anxious to get out as a motion picture, but also riding on the back end of Star Wars and the explosion of science fiction. And then the other thing, just to talk about the real timeline before we deviate off of this, Star Trek: The Motion Picture did okay. It didn't do incredible, but it did more than passable. It was a profitable release, made money for Paramount, so much so that they greenlit eventually Star Trek II, which again, we will fight about this if necessary. It is the best of the Star Trek movies, I think, hands down. No,
we're not going to fight about that.
Okay, good.
Well, actually, I'm more a 6 guy.
Oh, you're a 6 guy. So the
I'm a 6 guy.
6 was very good. 6 was very good, but I think it was a perfect send off for the original cast. But I still maintain that Wrath of Khan was the best.
But I guarantee we all agree those were the best uniformed Starfleet ever.
Yeah. Yes.
Absolutely. Yeah. Those uniforms were great.
I'll agree with that. Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan continued the movie franchise so that we end up getting to a Star Trek VI with the original cast and all the other that follow after that with the Next Generation cast and the other things that happened from that. Produces 3 and 4. They're like a trilogy. 2, 3, and 4 to a degree is what they are. And so we end up having a very successful Star Trek movie franchise. Really, the motion picture does okay. Wrath of Khan, the second movie, does it really well. Launches that off so much so that by the time we get to 87, there's the appetite for the Next Generation series and the Star Trek universe that we know, which we probably could talk about for several hours, but that's not the purpose of this. So if we get this is where the first time we're going to talk about the point of departure. If we get not the movie, Star Trek, the motion picture, we get that story, the God thing. By the way, it's almost exactly like an episode from the original series called The Changeling, just without all the special effects. Where it's not a Voyager. It's called Nomad is the probe that's gone. Let's say we actually do get that in series form launching there. The first question we're going to ask is, based upon what we know about it, would it have been any good? Would it have actually gained an audience? Would it have succeeded, I guess, is my first question.
I think if you look at the stories for the first season, I think it would have had a pretty typical first season slump for Star Trek. Deep Space Nine was maybe a little bit of an exception to this one. I actually thought the first season of Deep Space Nine was pretty good, but the first season of Next Generation was bad. The first season of Voyager was pretty rough. I mean, it took them a while to hit their stride. And so if you look at the scripts for phase two, not great stories, a lot of them, and so you'd hope that they would be able to at least get it past. You'd be able to do the second season, the Riker's beard, and maybe the season would get a little, or the second season would get a little better, and it would kind of find its stride. And I think that was the case for really all of the series that survived their full 7-year run. Is they got better, they got better and better. And I think Next Generation, you could say that. I think Deep Space Nine, you could definitely say that it got better and better by the end.
Yeah. So taking that as the premise that it would have had at a minimum, a rocky first season, probably gets a second season just because you can't give up on it, right? I mean, that was also sort of where Voyager was. Because again, we're talking about launching a network here, which Robert, you're reminding us as we were in the leading up to getting the recording mode, it would have been called it would have been called the
PTVS, the
Paramount Television Service.
Which they were advertising as the fourth channel.
Yeah, because later there would be the United Paramount Network, UPN, which we mentioned Voyager there, was the phase two concept of a show that would anchor the launch of a new network, which was essentially a syndicated network on stations that weren't otherwise affiliated. Star Trek did that. It just did that in the mid 90s is when it did that. This is 2 decades earlier that phase two would have served that role. And of course, Eric already mentioned that most of the original cast was back. There was the issue that was going on with Nimoy. Some of that was money, but some of that was very personal. Shatner was going to cost them, so they were concerned about whether they could afford him or keep him. So they had a ready backup plan there. Which, if you saw the motion picture, there's Will Decker. Well, the same actor, Stephen Collins, would have been in that role, in the commander role, and so that sort of filled the slot that Spock filled in the original series in terms of being the first officer. And then you had to have a Vulcan, right?
That is correct, which we get the character of Zon.
By the way, that's with an X for those of you playing at home, XON.
Yeah.
And if you saw Star Trek the motion picture, when the energy cloud, the God thing, as it were, goes by is an Epsilon station, if I remember correctly.
Yes,
and I'm really
correct.
okay. I'm really showing my nerd card now. But there's an actor that you see there, David Gutrow is his name, who actually is the person who was hired to play Zon. And there's, if you go searching around on YouTube and other places, you will find some of the screen tests and some of the shots from this and some of the mock-ups. So again, he sort of survives into the movie. He would have been in the show, and he's like a 22-year-old pure Vulcan. So he checks the Vulcan box, but it's all the fun of he's not battling, with the inner split genome problem that Spock has in terms of emotion, but he's actually playing with or toying with, as I read some of the treatments, the idea of emotions, because he's among a human crew and he needs to fit in and do that. So I think
he's
Eric,
basically
and Eric, with your permission, at some point I'm probably going to throw your background notes onto like the Discord channel or something like that.
I think that would be a great idea.
I think it would be a helpful thing to follow.
He was the predated Data.
he was the pre-data.
Well,
Yeah.
we could actually get into that how much of phase two was kind of reimagined and in some cases very 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 thinly disguised in Next Generation. I mean, it wasn't just Data, it was Riker and it was Troy as well. They were all very very thinly veiled phase two characters.
Yeah, talk about that a little bit, Eric. I mean, it's
So the Stephen Collins played Will Decker very differently in the movie than he was expected to play in phase two, and so he was very much intended to be sort of the captain in training. He was expected to be sort of a bit more physical, kind of like Shatner was in his youth, and so that is very thinly veiled to Commander William Riker in 1987, played by Jonathan Frakes, and who even looks a little like Stephen Collins. They even have a similar appearance. The beard changed that a little bit, but certainly the first season when he didn't have the beard, that was the case. And so that's very very thinly veiled with the two of them. So the other thing is Zahn was a Vulcan who had no emotions or very few emotions, but really wanted to explore emotions, wanted to have emotions, and so he was very much a Data character. He very much, and then there's also, interestingly enough, Roddenberry had a different program called Questor. I don't know if anybody remembers that one. I had to look it up. And it is about an android. They create an android who also wants to explore humanity. So you could argue that Data is kind of this weird amalgam of Zahn from phase two and Questor the android that kind of gels together and into creating what they eventually made for Data. And then Ilea, the Delta Navigator, became a Troy, a Betazoid ship's counselor, which is interesting because Ilea means Troy. If you're we talk about the story of the Iliad about Troy. Yeah. So they did so really thinly veiled if you know a little bit about your classics. And they're interesting archetypes. I mean, that's the thing, is it's not a bad thing. These became very interesting characters, and Data is honestly one of my very favorite characters in Star Trek overall. And part of that is because it's a cool concept. Part of it is also that Brent Spiner played him really well.
Yeah.
And it made it a very entertaining character.
Thanks for giving us excellent summary there, Eric, of all the things that go with that and how these characters are similar. They're similar and different. So that's one of the first departures that I immediately jump into mind, is that, if you have a successful or unsuccessful, it doesn't matter what it is. Once these characters have been spent to a degree in phase two, even if you come back later, you can't turn Decker into Riker as easily. You still may do it. You still may write essentially the same character and have the echo there, but you can't do it as easily if you've already had it before.
Right.
And so, eventually these characters, which become very well known to those that are fans of the Next Generation, even if there is in our alternate timeline, there ultimately becomes a Next Generation, whatever that phase three, whatever it would have looked like, who knows how it would have played out. Roddenberry doesn't have the same archetypes maybe to go back to, so that takes on a different look. So maybe the next show would have looked more like a DS9, or the next show would have had to take more of the Voyager twist, or it's easy to forget there was I watched this, I enjoyed it to some degree when I watched it. It's easy to forget there was Star Trek Enterprise. It just sort of gets lost in there in the shuffle of stuff, and then eventually, now that we're in the streaming world, Discovery and
Strange New Worlds,
which the irony there is, like Enterprise, they're going back. It's the prequel concept now being told because of what's there, and then of course ultimately you get the relaunch of the movies and the Next Generation cast. But just this first departure is, if all of this stuff happens in phase two, it doesn't happen necessarily the same way somewhere else down the road. And the biggest departure for me, and this is what I want to hear the panel sort of talk about, is successful or unsuccessful. When we talked off podcast, Eric Rush had suggested this. Let's say it gets its 5-year run. By the way, the 5-year magic, why it was a 5-year mission, is that's the magic to get enough episodes to get into syndication. Just so everybody knows, at approximately 22 episodes a season, that gets you over the 100 mark. Your 5-year mission has got you into making money down the road. But if we have a 5-year run of phase 2, so let's say 77 to 82. What's the best upside for that? What's the best that can probably be?
I would say Gene Roddenberry gets kicked out after the first season.
Yeah, well, something, or he has creative control wrested from him, and more responsible hands would be at the helm, because that was actually some of the chaos that did happen in Next Generation. So he was much more involved in the first couple of seasons, and eventually he was he was sort of not pushed out completely, but pushed aside in favor of people like Rick Berman. And so, so his influence from, the third season on was very limited, and he died during the fifth season. So he died during that season, but those last couple of years, his influence was really reduced, and you can tell because the show got a lot better. Because by third season it was pretty good. Fourth and fifth season of Star Trek Next Generation were excellent. They were really some of the best Star Trek TV shows in my opinion. But he wasn't really involved in those, and so the question is would you have that? Not necessarily because of his health concerns so much, just because he was, a chaotic manager and had very odd ideas, and was tore through writers, at a breakneck pace after a while. Would they have also said
had relationships with any female cast member that apparently existed, if everything is to be believed, which also
in the original series? That's in the original series. Well, and that's why Nichelle Nichols broke up with him is because he was too busy dating Majel Bure, who he eventually married. So yeah, that's neither here nor there.
Well, Gene Roddenberry possessed a singular brilliance to introduce ideas, but could not see them to fruition. He needed the tactical people on the back end to make it happen for him, because he would come up with these brilliant, it's like they got 7 seasons, I think 6 maybe, out of the TV syndicated show Andromeda. It was basically done with 2 pages from him, his notes.
Yeah. To me, the interesting concept there, as you were talking about, would it have been wrested away from his control, Eric, which I think it would have been, especially if they had that rocky first season. It would have been, this is too good of a property that's got too much following for us to waste this opportunity. And so, the sacking of Roddenberry would have come probably at some point.
Well, and not only that, but remember, you're relying on a whole this to prop up a new network.
Yeah,
that you sunk money into.
Yeah,
and also he keeps threatening one of his creative producers, there's a producer on the show who basically was one of the most interesting people I've ever read about. He's a veteran of both World War II and of the 7 Days War for Israel. And he's convinced that Roddenberry would attack him if he stayed in the same room with him for too long, because Roddenberry would just lose it. And it got to this point where this relationship that he would just keep quitting. And I'm getting the feeling that after the first season, they see like Roddenberry is too much of a loose cannon to keep him in like a creative consulting job, like what happened with TNG, but we're going to move in these other producers to just streamline the show.
So if it has a 5-year run as a show, is there ever a Star Trek movie of any ilk?
I think so. I think if you have a reasonably successful run in 1982, I think you could see it maybe a 1983, 1984 movie. Whether there are more movies depends on the success of that movie. You would wonder. So presumably the pilot of the series would have been what is now Star Trek: The Motion Picture. So that's off the table. And so would they have had the foresight to do something really really popular like Wrath of Khan?
Yeah.
Would they have brought Khan back for in phase 2 in some way, and could there be even a somewhat different Wrath of Khan? I don't know.
And the second thing is, I think after season 2, Shatner's gone. Shatner would want too much money, and that was the whole propping up of Will Decker from the beginning, was to have that there.
They wanted that hanging over Shatner to know that he's important, but he's not that important.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's why they kept writing scenes for him to have his shirt torn. They were shaming him because they were like, "You need to be on a strict weight loss regimen, Bill." But I agree. The star of the Barbary Coast needs too much money. He's got to go off. We have a perfectly good Will Decker here. And who knows, maybe in a few years they could bring Shatner in for a movie. Because if it wasn't for the motion picture, Leonard Nimoy would never have come back to Star Trek, because it was Robert Wise who cleared up the syndication money issues with Nimoy in order to bring him back on.
Well, and contract negotiations are why they first started doing the 2-part episodes, the cliffhangers, and Next Generation. So season 3, season 4, the best of both worlds, which is the best episode of Star Trek ever, in my opinion.
With the best villain. With the best villains.
With the best villain. And Patrick Stewart was, and Patrick Stewart is not William Shatner. Patrick Stewart is a much better actor and a much better human than William Shatner. But he was going up for contract negotiations. And so, and when the cliffhanger happened, they didn't know what was going to happen. They didn't know if they were going to kill him off or not. And because they're like, well, Frakes can take over. He can be captain if this falls through. So it's kind of in any ways the same scenario.
And in some ways, it became the running joke in the Next Generation of, isn't it time for you to be moving on and having your own ship commander?
Nah.
Kind of thing.
Hey, it took 7 seasons and 3 movies to get him to do that.
That's right. Yeah. Well, and the movie he finally did it was the second worst Star Trek movie. And nothing can be as bad as Final Frontier, but Nemesis.
Agreed.
Nemesis was the second worst Star Trek movie.
Which is also why wresting away control from Roddenberry, is a good idea. Not giving Bill Shatner full control for a movie is also,
right.
As Star Trek 5 proves, not the best idea either.
Which Roddenberry also hated, because he accused Shatner of stealing his idea.
Which is ironic given what, again, join our Discord server.
Yeah.
See the notes that we're going to post there. Eric's got the full background on that, because that was also one of the knocks against Roddenberry, was that he was taking credit for ideas that weren't his, or taking credit for writing in some instances that he may not have actually, done the bulk of, kind of thing. He may have edited other folks and said that I wrote that kind of deal. Allegedly.
I have to say, going through the descriptions of the episodes for the first season, there are a few good ideas in there that I really liked. One, which was going to be a 2-parter called Katimba, was going to be this exploration of Klingon culture, which was essentially going to copy and paste the Japanese caste system of before the Meiji era, and put it onto the Klingons, which is not a drastic departure from what we got, but definitely more nuanced than Space Vikings in TNG. Yeah. I think that's not a controversial statement to make.
No, it would be an important part of important complexity for the Klingons that they really don't get for a long time. I mean, you think about, when do Klingons get any sort of complexity? And I would say it's probably mid-season 2, Next Generation. Even the first season with Worf, he's a pretty typical Klingon. And then once you get Ronald Moore, writing scripts for Next Generation with the Klingons, then you start to get a little bit more background. There's a little more of a broader culture to them, and they get a lot more interesting. And
do we start getting that earlier, you think?
Well, hopefully it would be very different. I mean, it would be a very different, and you don't know, would they have the same appearance, because they didn't have that. They
didn't keep the same appearance through all the iterations that we have today.
No. Don't get me started on that. So So the way they appeared in the motion picture was there was some iterations of that, but it was basically the same through the end of the kind of the TNG era, Nemesis in 2002. Well, and then even into Enterprise, and then they explained why they didn't look like regular Klingons. And that was not bad. That was an okay explanation. It was sleight of hand, but I bought it. And
it got two explanations. Well, the first one was an explanation. Yeah. In the crossover with DS9 in the original series, we got yes, they're Klingons. No, we don't talk about it with outsiders.
We don't talk about it. Yeah.
and then they eventually framed it up in Enterprise by having it be a genetic manipulation from Data's ancestor, which was just amazing.
Yeah. There were some good Enterprise episodes too, but yeah. But anyway, I do think, Eric, I think you're right. I think you have a much richer Klingon culture much earlier, and I think it would be not totally different, but a little bit different.
Yeah. I know we talked about William Shatner probably getting kicked off after season 2 with a shakeup. Decker becomes the captain. Do you think we would see Spock be brought back onto the show? Like maybe they'd say, well, Roddenberry is no longer the direct boss. Do you think they're able to bring Leonard Nimoy from his production of Equus?
Yeah.
By the way, he is not the young boy Alan Strand in Equus. He is the psychiatrist who's really the main character. For anyone, for the Equus fans out there.
He was also doing In Search Of at that time.
He was doing In Search Of, which yes. that was a weird show too. Yeah, if they could afford him, then I think maybe you do bring him back in some fashion. Because I think a lot of his objections would be gone. I mean, Roddenberry would be gone. That was his biggest objection. And Nimoy and Shatner had a very complex relationship. So Shatner being gone may have smoothed some of that out too. So yeah. I could see Nimoy coming back in 79 for season 3, at least in some fashion. Maybe not as a regular, but maybe he would be, have some guest appearances or something like that.
In this world, in this transition, he becomes the head of the Vulcan Science Academy.
Yeah.
And so he gets
so you have reasons to have him appear or have an episode plot line that involves that. And of course, if you look at the Next Generation in the real timeline, he made appearances there. So by that point, they were trying to connect together these eras of Star Trek in a way that gave some continuity, which they continue to do through some other things as well. Of course, the benefits of Vulcans having very long lives allow you to do some some interesting things there. To me, the most curious thing about the idea of a whatever level of moderate success that you might see a phase 2 have in the late 70s and into the early 80s is I do think it ripples through the subsequent series not being the same. And so there's a lot of cultural. You mentioned, Eric, you're right. Best of Both Worlds, I think, is just about as good as television science fiction could get in that era. I think there's been better since then. The reimagined Battlestar Galactica does some pretty amazing things in a different way as a character drama. But in terms of just, hitting that right thing of action plus classic science fiction, Best of Both Worlds gets there, like I say, the best villains ever in the Borg.
Yeah.
And, so we would have what would be missing with a phase 2? If I said resistance is futile, it wouldn't mean quite the same thing to you now, because we probably would have lost that. Or some of the elements of, would eventually become Voyager because of DS9 and, this concept of Bajorans and the other quadrants and all of this other stuff, whether that would come to be. I think we would have lost a lot of the later Star Trek because of the earlier Star Trek. And then the question is, what gets pulled into that earlier, like you said, better development of the Klingons? Do we see Romulans start playing the role that they begin to play later in other iterations of Star Trek? How would that have played out? And I think the question that I want to ask there is that what Star Trek did a lot, the original series all the way through, was to be moral plays about things that were going on in reality. And so one of the things that you get is, what would late 70s, early 80s phase 2 look like if it's trying to tell stories in a science fiction genre that are somehow paralleled to the real world, because that's what Roddenberry was doing back in TOS, where he was doing it in all kinds of allegorical ways, almost to a degree, to be able to make it work.
Well, the Klingons.
Go ahead, Eric.
The Klingons would still be used as sort of the surrogate for the Soviet Union for the Cold War, and so I think you see a much more aggressive, maybe even a war, between the Federation and the Klingons at that point. But certainly hostilities, certainly they're not allies. And interestingly enough, you see some subtle thawing, and you see some basic mentions of this early on in Next Generation in the late 80s. But you can clearly see that the thawing of the Cold War and the kind of alliance with the Klingons in Next Generation really go hand in hand. So I don't think you'd have that yet. I think you'd still have the Klingons as being. I think they would still be the primary foes. I think the Romulans would probably show up. I don't think I don't think you get Borg. I don't think there's any chance you get Borg in Phase 2, because no Maurice Hurley. If you don't have Maurice Hurley there, then you don't get the episode Q Who where they introduce the Borg. And if you don't get that doesn't happen. And he was still writing for like the Equalizer or something like that by this point, by the early 80s. And so you don't get Maurice Hurley. So I think you miss out on the best villain in Star Trek, and probably one of the best villains in any science fiction.
Well, I think the other thing I think you get a season where the Enterprise is more in Earth vicinity, because potentially you get a corrupt Federation, a la Watergate. Back in.
Interesting. That's a good thought.
That he writes an allegory. I know it's about 4 years past, but it was hanging over the Ford presidency the entire time. So you get a nice allegorical story of a corrupt Federation at some level, and so Star Trek the Enterprise has to be around Earth vicinity, and maybe that's what they used to get rid of Kirk. Kirk moves into the Admiralty.
I think that's the proper way for any Star Trek character to die. Just ignominiously on a weird planet with a tar creature.
Pasha Yar, we hardly knew thee.
Yeah. Until yesterday's Enterprise. But
which is also a really, really good episode.
Yes.
I have an idea for what a later episode would be for their last season, and I'm almost tempted to say this is the episode that gets it canceled. Are you guys familiar with the idea called Blood and Fire? It was suggested by a Star Trek TNG writer, David Gerald, where he wanted to write an episode dealing with the AIDS crisis, where they would find a derelict ship that had been taken over by Regalian bloodworms. And it was the idea that they were going to deal with the fear about AIDS and encouraging people to still go and donate blood to the Red Cross, because there were fears about that, as that was one of the ways it could be transmitted to you if you had someone who was infected. And that episode got killed off immediately by Rick Berman. Since this is going to be early 80s, 1983 being the cutoff, and the first outbreak case of HIV/AIDS was 1981, maybe we see this be one of the things to where they try to address it. As opposed to that one episode where Riker goes to the planet of androgynous aliens who all look like women, strangely. And let's not talk about that one right now.
Well, that's one of the episodes. And there are a couple others that you look at with modern eyes and you're like, oh, what were they thinking? There's a lot that I think, and it's funny, obviously we're looking at this with an 80s 90s lens on these programs in the 2020s, and there are aspects of these programs that have aged exceptionally well for what they are, but there are also aspects of them that have aged exceptionally poorly, and you can tell that they're a product of their time.
Yeah.
But it's easy for us to. One of the things that Roddenberry did brilliantly in the original series, and you do see it, in TNG. You've seen it throughout Star Trek all the way through. Is push the limits and the edges of what the censors would allow, or tell stories in ways that managed to get past the censors, particularly in the late 60s. Whether I'm actually going to, this is for the benefits of the guys here. It does nothing for you that are listening, but I'm about to go grab something off my shelf here in a minute, but to show you guys something. But the concept is, if you take, I can't even think of the name of the episode now, the half white, half black.
Let that be your last battlefield.
Yeah. It is very clearly this allegorical thing about race in a way that is, done in a way that he could get away with it because it's science fiction, the way that it's done. The famous interracial kiss is because, well, they're not really choosing to do this. They're being forced to do this, but yet, making the point of it. And Roddenberry did that pretty well. He did some strange stuff as well, but when he nailed that, is the way that I would argue it, in terms of, getting exposure there, to what was there. I think you would have seen that continue on, probably, to your point, Eric. They may have hit a point where eventually that became their demise for some reason, but there was a desire to not just tell space stories, I guess is my point. They wanted to tell these human stories that were set in that genre. Let somebody else talk while I grab what's off my shelf here.
Well, just basing what you said, Don, about human stories, George R.R. Martin, writer of Game of Thrones and other book series, he tried to become a writer for TNG, and he recounted saying, I was having an interview with the producer, and they asked, well, what kind of writer are you? And he says, well, I write all kinds of stories, fantasy stories, science fiction stories. And they're like, well, Star Trek The Next Generation is not a show about science fiction. It is a show about people. He did not get the job.
Interestingly enough, Be Your Last Battlefield, played by Frank Gorshin,
the
Riddler from Batman.
This is 1968, published by Ballantine Books, a Del Rey book. I'm showing the making of Star Wars, or Star Trek. Second time I've done that. Last time I've done it. Literally is sort of the backstory about the show being made, and I've had this since I was pretty young. I don't know. I've had this for a long time.
We literally lost 40 plus Star Trek pocketbooks when we had our water incident 2 years ago that were oddly enough, to show you how life works. Most of them were my wife's before we got married.
Oh. Robert, that's how you knew you were marrying well, right?
It was one of those. People looked at us and said, we're so glad y'all found each other and didn't inflict this much nerdism on anyone else.
So the book that I'm showing here tells the backstory of the series being made and all kinds of stuff like that. But we were talking about getting things past the censors. If you know some of the situations there, females that are clad in the original series often show a lot of skin. It's just skin at odd places in terms of what was being revealed, and so the side of a torso, if that's all that you see while everything else is fully covered, could get past the censors, but yet it was somehow risque because it was not something that you normally saw. And so they had this ability to slide things by in terms of plot, by the way that they would just disguise them in these allegorical type stories, but then also pushing the limits for, just normal, costume, sensuality in late 60s television that was not really allowed, that Roddenberry was always... Go buy your Roddenberry biography. We won't even go there. But Roddenberry was always pushing those limits as well for apparently other reasons. But this was an aspect of what was there. So I think what we've come to the conclusion is Roddenberry is dismissed, let's say, at the end of the first season of Phase 2. Does it take a dramatically different turn there, or is it just sort of the same concept? Just no, what do they call him, Eric? What was the nickname for Gene? The
Great Bird of the Galaxy.
Great Bird of the Galaxy. If the Great Bird of the Galaxy has flown, how much of that concept of I want to tell moral plays and and tell stories that are somehow reflective of what's going on in the real world versus being, which science fiction always is. But good science fiction, by the way, always is that. That's the nature of what it really is. But that was one of the overt things about it as a TV show.
I think it looks a lot like TNG. I think you have a rough first season. I think he's dismissed. I think you have a second season. Let's assume no writer's strike. What happened to the second season? But you can tell that some of the old scripts that they recycled, and they weren't that great. But then you had some very good second season episodes, but it was a little bumpy. And then by third season, hit its stride. I could easily see the same thing happening to phase 2, and potentially ending strong in season 5. And if TNG got its movie after the 7th season, but if they had ended after 5, it would have had a movie too. Just would have been in 1992 instead of 1994. So I think you see something like that.
Okay. The question I've been dying to ask is, would we have a Decker maneuver?
Yes.
Yeah,
but I don't know what it would be.
Now, are you referring to the Picard maneuver with the Stargazer, or the other Picard maneuver?
I'm talking about the Riker maneuver. That is,
constantly stepping over the chair,
or that's constantly pulling down the costume because it was riding up.
It was riding up, and I don't think so. I mean, I think a couple things. I mean, I think you have Frakes is a big dude. And so I think the uniforms didn't necessarily fit him that well. There's a Star Trek podcast that out there that is actually pretty cool, and Frakes will come on the podcast sometimes. He seems like a great guy. Like he'd be a lot of fun to hang out with. But also
he directed most of modern Trek episodes. I think
he has. He has. But he had a back injury from doing, I don't know, he's doing something when he was, before he kind of hit with acting, he was doing some sort of manual labor job, and he had a pretty significant back injury. And so he always leans and steps over things and things like that because it's just easier on his back. So I think you have some reasons, for some specific reasons that are specific to Jonathan Frakes, that you have some of those maneuvers that probably wouldn't have been there for Stephen Collins. So no, that's a really long answer for no.
For something that's pretty trivial, but still not for us. So Shatner's career, if let's say he's ousted in season 2, season 3 of phase 2.
There's always TJ Hooker.
He prays for TJ Hooker, man.
Okay, so we still see him in a cop uniform at some point.
Yeah, maybe Boston Legal.
Yeah, well, yeah,
maybe Boston Legal.
He's had an interesting, diverse, post-Trek career in a lot of ways. It's a little bit unusual in that sense. The first thing that jumps to my mind, are there any, particularly in this, I think a lot here of the Next Generation cast, you were just mentioning Jonathan Frakes there, Eric Rush, is, people that we know today, would they have had the careers that they would have had, that they have had, or would they have not had the careers that they've had if they had not been, if the Next Generation had not been what it was when it was? So, for example, Patrick Stewart, a Royal Shakespeare Company trained actor, he was going to work.
It would have been very different. It would. Yeah. I mean, he would have stayed. I mean, he would have stayed West End. He would have been, he would have been continued in his career the way he was, I think, for the most part.
He does not make Charles Xavier an X-Men.
No,
without the Next Generation.
And I think most of the cast is stays relatively obscure. The one person who I think would still have some amount of fame would be LeVar Burton, because he was already pretty well known at that point. So I think
for Roots, he was great.
Roots and Reading Rainbow. I knew him. That one of the reasons why I watched the Next Generation is because he was on it. Because when I was a kid, so I grew up in the 80s, I always watched Reading Rainbow, and I loved it. It was a great show. Take a look; it's in a book, right? And so when I heard that, I was 8 when it premiered, and so I heard that he was going to be in the show, and I'm like, well, I'm going to watch this show that has LeVar Burton in it. He's great, and then I was hooked from there.
The other ones that popped to mind there, because it's easy to forget, but not to forget, because I actually saw some things about her recently. You had Whoopi Goldberg playing this sort of recurring role. Whoopi is a movie actress. She's a movie star by this point. Her career is not going to be, different without the Next Generation, but it is different because of the Next Generation. There are a group of people that were exposed to who she was and what she was about, because she was in that genre and in that place that might not have taken place. Brett Spiner is a quality actor. He would have landed and done something. We just wouldn't know him as Data. Which is the other thing that immediately jumps to mind there, because I think this was a lot of what Nimoy struggled with in so many ways, was this idea of becoming typecast and the danger of becoming typecast. And so, when we start thinking about these actors that played in the subsequent series that are so well known to us, particularly as fans of the series and fans of the genre, we know them primarily from that. From that exposure. We've seen them in other things. We know them from other things. We know they might argue they'd have been better off if Brett Spiner maybe somewhere going have a little bit I'm not Data, kind of moment, just like Nimoy's had the I'm not Spock kind of moments so often because of how it may have limited his range and what he did as an actor. Robert, you're nodding up and down.
Well,
so.
I'm thinking also, you don't see Marina Sirtis. Brent Spiner's biggest role before Star Trek was what? Night Court.
Mm-hmm.
He played the hick guy on Night Court that ran the concession stand after a few other, and you don't see him. You don't see Patrick Stewart never grows out. Marina Sirtis, who's that? Denise Crosby, definitely not, even though Michael Dorn probably does Chips, and that's pretty much the end of his career because he really hasn't done much since Star Trek. You don't do you get? I guess my next question is, how does this affect Paramount streaming?
We haven't even talked about this idea of which I think I want to explore just a little bit, and this may be one of those things we circle back to at some point, but. If phase 2 is successful enough to carry on for 5 years, that suggests that this network gets some traction.
Mm-hmm.
And this is well ahead. This is, when did Fox come as in the late 80s, early 90s?
Late 80s.
Early 90s?
Yeah.
I'll just throw it out there. What's different about having suddenly this fourth network that starts gaining a little traction where that's, they're in remembering this is before cable becomes widespread. So you're talking about a broadcast network here that, is going to be fighting for what that means to be a broadcast network. But, do we reasonably have, I guess it's hard for me to remember what to call it because I want to keep calling it UPN, Robert, and I know that it's not. But,
we can call it UPN.
Yeah.
And we'll know what we mean.
Yeah. So this earlier version of a UPN, does that mean there's no Fox? Does that mean Fox comes earlier because the viability of this idea of being able to launch a network exists? I mean, outside of we spend a lot of time talking about how this impacts Trek, but outside of Trek, in the business entertainment world, what does this mean?
If I may, gentlemen, I have something to recommend. Well, if the corporate leadership stays the same, Barry Diller, who spearheaded Fox's network, is the guy who gave the green light to The Simpsons. So that might appear on UPN. But two other gentlemen, Jeffrey Katzenberg and Michael Eisner, if they stay with UPN, Disney might go bankrupt if there's no Disney Renaissance without them kind of bullying them. And the Black Cauldron might be good. Might be super dark, but good.
So you're saying if we get phase 2, death to the Lion King. That's what you're saying here.
To the Lion King. Scar wins.
The mouse goes. No World War II. No, never mind. That was a totally different episode. Sorry.
That'll be our part 2.
That's an interesting thought because if those guys had major impacts on the studios and the organizations where they went. Yeah. This is when they're still in their, young in the business, cutting their teeth kind of mode. They're not, Eisner's not Eisner yet.
Yeah. And Katzenberg, without Katzenberg, there's no Shrek film franchise. How would the internet survive without the Shrek memes, Don? I ask thee. or Prince of Egypt for that matter, doesn't happen. And that's probably one of DreamWorks' best movies.
Jerry Eisenberg. I mean, this is like the who's who of studio for the major part. And if they all stick around Paramount long enough to run it, that has huge impacts.
And other names have come up here. Some of the folks, Ronald Moore being one of the ones that was mentioned, as well as others that, become a very big part of the post Roddenberry Trek brain trust. Is that a fair term maybe to use to some degree to describe them?
And even other shows, because I mean, you'd mentioned the rebooted Battlestar from 2006 on, which was excellent. No Ronald Moore, no Battlestar.
Yeah. And even some of the stuff that Moore has done here recently, the work with Foundation on Apple TV and some of the other things that are there. He continues to be a giant in the sci-fi genre, among other places. But if there's no, he's not there in the late set. He's in that next phase. He's in that next wave. That's the part of the next generation, and sliding into DS9 and Voyager, and that ilk, the late 80s into the early 90s iterations of Trek is where we find him.
You really don't get DS9, because DS9 was his baby all the way.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, for sure. And
the whole story there, chasing a rabbit here to some degree, but the correlation between DS9 and Babylon 5 is also sort of well known in terms of competing concepts that were out there. They're different shows, but competing concepts. But the point that I'm trying to make there is a lot of science fiction plays off of other science fiction in terms of thematic riffing and rhyming kind of thing that happens in such a way that the thing that immediately jumps to mind, maybe we talked about Ronald Moore, the reimagined Battlestar.
Mm-hmm.
What happens to the original Battlestar if there's a thriving phase 2 in 77? Battlestar's in 78, if my memory serves correctly.
Correct.
That's right. Yeah, that's a good point, Don. We're not even to what I consider the real Battlestar. We may not even get there. We may not even get the first one.
And so, my question then becomes, and I don't know the answer to this,
or does the first one survive because ABC pumps the right amount of money into it to keep?
And right. And conceptually, is it taking some different things from phase 2? Because there was one of the joys of TOS is there was a certain amount of camp to it.
Right.
And with the original Battlestar, there was a lot of camp to it. And so I think do you have a little bit more of a serious original Battlestar? What does that do to the future of the Battlestar franchise? Because I think you had the 2006 series that was very serious, very good, but very serious.
Yeah, it was. It had an element of dark to it that you weren't going to get that in 78. That wasn't going to happen. But I'm just going to read it out. Eric Bond has suggested this has an impact on presidential politics, but we'll come back to that. At some
okay, all right. Put it on the list. Put it on the list.
But I do think just because I can see it playing either way. Is the universe big enough for all these science fiction shows to all, is there a critical mass that allows them to play off of each other in a way that it's beneficial to all of the things that are in that genre? Or is there a limited amount of, in this case, actual broadcast space? Because we're sort of in the pre-cable era that, that phase 2 crowds out of Battlestar Galactica. So I could see either scenario happening.
But we're just at the cusp of it though. Right. And so we're late 70s, early 80s. And so by the time we get in there, by the time we get to the end of the run, people are starting to get cable. So I remember when I was 5 years old, I moved into the house that I mostly grew up in with my parents. And we had one of those big rotary boxes on top of the console TV. And we had 34 channels.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought I was living in the future. And so that's so, I mean, and this was 1984. This is only a couple of years after that. And so you don't really have to get very far before you're able to start branching out. And I think we know now that there's, infinite streaming, we know that the kind of the popular consciousness can handle a lot of sci-fi, because there's a ton of sci-fi out there and a lot of really good sci-fi out there today.
Yeah.
Well, who knows? Maybe with the advent of cable, UPN becomes basically just a cable network, to where they can then really push the limit of what they can show with Star Trek. Because in the first season of Phase 2, our Unheard Melody Suite, they were planning on that episode containing a ton of nudity, because the Enterprise would encounter a world in serious lack of men.
And that with was, that,
and you wonder why somebody wanted to wrestle control away from
Gene
Roddenberry.
The strangest bird in the galaxy.
The dirtiest bird in the galaxy.
Dirtiest bird in the galaxy, for sure.
Do you guys think Gene Roddenberry would start a different show? Like he said, they're not Star Trek. This is the real Star Trek, but we can't call it that because I don't have the rights. I'm going to call it Andromeda, and this is my Star Trek with ABC.
Wasn't that previously mentioned? Wasn't that an episode where Wesley Crusher, I can't remember the name of it, Wesley Crusher was going to be executed for violating the rule of the first season, like third episode, maybe?
Yeah, the first season was so long ago.
It sounds very familiar. I'm like, hang on a second.
We had to put quality memories into our brains after that first season. But I remember with the half-naked blonde people and It's a Paradise. I remember that one. Slightly more exciting Masterpiece Society.
Wow. What did we miss here, guys? We could wreck on track for a long time.
Well, we can come back to it. We could come back to the different point of departure, but not even Phase 2. We could come back to. I would love to come back to a kind of departure in the kind of the next generation era. That would be, I think that could be a lot of fun.
I tried to find the world where George Lucas was tapped to direct Star Trek Planet of the Titans, which was going to be their big movie before Phase 2, but he was already in production for Star Wars
Trek.
at that time.
Star Wars. What about Spielberg?
Yeah, Spielberg.
I mean, he was what, a couple years before Close Encounters, or right around the same time as Close Encounters.
Close Encounters was 70, I think was
78?
Yeah.
78,
Close Encounters is actually what convinced them that they could make Star Trek the motion picture. Because they thought, well, if Star Wars is already out, no one's going to see another science fiction movie for at least 5 years. And then when they saw how well and Close Encounters of the Third Kind did, they were like, we can now make our Star Trek motion picture and be financially safe. So maybe in answer to our earlier question, with all of this broadcasting of sci-fi, maybe there was enough room for all of it to be there.
Yeah. But eventually all of the networks, I think with maybe the exception of CBS, and CBS has always been a slightly different animal in that sense. No, that's not true. CBS went the Logan's Run route at some point, which you can call
with DC Fontana.
Is
longtime Star Trek writer.
Yeah. But NBC went the route with Buck Rogers, ABC went the route with Battlestar Galactica, CBS played with the TV adaptation of the movie Logan's Run after 76. So everybody was trying to dip their wick in the Star Trek success to some degree that was there. And so I think there would have been space for things like this. And again, remember the whole reason in my mind why they were willing to do this was there was already Star Trek had the benefit of already having a following. I mean, it was what had sustained it through syndication, what had, the animated series and all the things that were there. It was a risky thing for Paramount to launch a network, but it was less risky if you had Star Trek as the flagship show, that it wasn't like, launching something that nobody had ever not heard of, that you were trying to get an audience for. You were going to get a built-in audience, just like you got for The Next Generation in 87. You were going to get a built-in audience, no matter what, because it had Star Trek.
But there's only one important question I want to ask all of you. With Star Trek Phase 2, do you think there finally would have been enough support to launch Poor Devil, starring Sammy Davis Jr. and Christopher Lee, as a permanent TV series?
Probably not.
Yeah.
There's no universe that happens in.
What?
No universe. All right.
Well, we will probably come back and revisit some of these ideas at some point. There's a lot here, and obviously, as everybody can tell, we're all pretty passionate about Star Trek.
Yeah. So I'm going to try to bring us to some type of logical soft landing here, and but part of the reason I enjoy doing that, we talk about it all the time. Part of the reason I enjoy doing this show is conversations like this with these guys, that as I look at two of the guys that are on my screen now, I didn't know before Alexis and I started this thing, and so we shared this passion for something, and we're separated, didn't have an opportunity to talk about it. But it's also the realization that we talk a lot about serious history. We do talk a lot about some serious history, but not all history and not all what ifs have to be life and death. They can be pop culture, but understand the influence of pop culture. I think, Robert, you and I talked about this the first episode we did on Star Wars, is that if you say a Vader-esque character, you don't have to explain what you mean. I mean, that's just in popular culture now. You can walk up to somebody who was not alive when The Next Generation was on the air, or when Best of Both Worlds, that little cliffhanger over 2 seasons there, the way they crafted that so carefully. You can walk up to them and say resistance is futile. That resonates with them because these things are iconic in our culture, and they permeated into our culture. And so without them, our culture would be different.
And Star Trek gave us, come on, flip phones. Tell me that's not a communicator.
Yeah.
The pad.
I was going to say my Kindle.
Yeah. Or an iPad. Yeah. There's whole documentaries. In fact, I'll see if I can find a link to it. There's whole documentaries about how Star Trek affected the idea of what science, of real science, thinking about real science and technology innovation as well.
I'm waiting for my tricorder to make my job so much easier.
Well, the first streaming service I ever signed up for, was willing to pay for, and not to steal from a parent's or Grace's parents, my fiance, is Paramount Plus, because I just wanted to watch all of the Star Treks.
Yeah.
There you go.
Including Lower Decks.
Lower Decks is funny.
I like Lower Decks. It's my Friday escape.
Yeah. No, I love the fourth wall breaking. I love the inside jokes. I think it's really funny and clever, and yeah, I'm a fan of Lower Decks, and I think all the voice actors are great.
What is everybody's favorite branch of Star Trek? Just as like a final poll.
Well, I think that's a good question, Eric. I'm going to let Robert go first.
And we can share them. It's fine. It's a big enough fan base.
Enterprise, actually.
Really?
I'm gonna take the weird one. I really liked Enterprise. I so wish Enterprise had done its 4th season or its 3rd season. Is it 2nd season? The season it hit stride.
Yeah.
That if they had started that,
pretty good.
Fourth,
I'll give you that.
That last season, it was 4. That's right. If they had done that season as the 2nd season of Enterprise, it would have made it 7 years.
Except for that final.
Don't even get me started on the finale.
Oh my god, that was terrible.
But except for that 4th season of Enterprise showed
it was good.
Promise that show had.
It was good. I agree.
Okay, Eric Rush.
Next Generation.
Next Generation.
Not even by. I mean, not even by a little.
Okay. Eric Bond.
Deep Space Nine. Strange New Worlds is gaining on it, but Deep Space Nine so far is my favorite.
I think if you had the quality of Deep Space Nine that you did during the whole Dominion War arc, I would agree with you.
Yeah.
Because that Dominion War arc that was season 6 and 7, really, really good.
Absolutely.
Eric Rush, I'm going to go with you, TNG, but I have to qualify it by saying it's really the latter half of the series. I remember I was in college when it premiered. and would someday I'll explain this to half of our listeners. Videotaped it when I couldn't watch it, when I couldn't watch it live. But it really didn't hit, as you said, it really didn't hit its stride really probably till that third season. Once it hit its stride and the characters were more than two-dimensional in a lot of ways, they developed some depth with the characters. The stories were better. I'll take seasons 3 through the finale of Star Trek: The Next Generation and call it the best Trek. On the movie side, Star Trek II: Wrath of Khan, no ifs, ands, or buts. But I really liked, this is a whole other thing we'll probably do for a different episode, I liked the Abrams reboot. There were things I really liked about the J.J. Abrams reboot, Star Trek coming back, but that's for
another Kelvin.
Yeah. So the only thing I'll mention here as we get to close out here, guys, is that we have started our Discord channel. And so if you're not familiar with the Discord server, we're starting to get traction there. We have a chance to interact with our audience, and that has been fun. I've enjoyed that over the last week. So you can go there, by the way, to put comments on this episode. So there's a link in the show notes, also on the website, about how to join the server. And it's a place to put comments there, suggestions for episodes, just interact with the team here and all the other things that are there. You'll find all the things that you always have found at www.aforkandtimepodcast.com. So check us out there. And getting really excited about picking back up with finishing work on the Bo Breslin series as we come back to the Living Constitutions, and some stuff I know we're already talking about that's brewing probably for after the first of the year. So good stuff going on here. I appreciate the team. I appreciate the opportunity that you guys give us to come into your headphones, your speakers, wherever we appear when you listen to us as a podcast. Thanks for giving us that little bit of time. Anybody have anything they want to say before we close? And we will close this one out.
Live long and prosper.
Yeah, live long. Alexis isn't here, so I got to throw this to somebody. Robert, if we happen upon a fork in time, what's our suggestion to our listeners?
Take it.
Take it. All right. Thanks, guys.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.